Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Mr. Chris Verdonk, who's going to talk about cross-sector information sharing, an interesting journey. Chris, who is a partner at Deloitte Enterprise Risk Services, but also created Enterprise Risk Services Department in Deloitte in 1995, I believe, and was the managing director of Deloitte's ERS for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Chris has served large, complex clients and sensitive organizations for well over a decade across various industries, often focusing on technology risk management. He's led a number of projects relating to cyber, including cyber strategy and implementation, regulation and compliance, and enterprise risk management. Deloitte started a cyber threat information research project in 2012. The project aimed to understand the value of information sharing of technical indicators of compromise across countries and industries. They've had an interesting journey on that project, and this morning Mr. Verdonk is going to share with us his experience. Chris, take us into lunch.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
So still morning. Good morning, everyone, and pleasure to be here. And thank you very much also to NATO and NIAS for the kind invitation. And as they were also one of the partners that collaborated with us in this initiative. And let me see how. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is about the experiences that we had in the journey since 2012, actually. And I think that most of you are still figuring out, as we heard from previous speakers, the best way to share intel, how to use intel and all of that stuff. And we all realize, I think, on a daily basis that it's not easy. And I think that it will continue not to be easy. But at least I hope that our perspectives on the project that we've been doing that's going to help you define the next steps. So I'm going to start with the introduction to a little bit about why we started the journey and to give a little bit of context on that. And then I'm going to talk about the learnings that we had from this particular project. So if you think about the background and where we started, you can actually see that we had different industries working with ourselves. We had manufacturing, telecom, oil and gas, services, but also public sector was there. So it was actually a pretty, I would say, differentiated group with many different industries that normally don't talk to each other. And if you look at an as a country, we have pockets of initiatives that actually are within energy, for instance, within a particular country. But you rarely see, at that time, 2012, also initiatives that actually broader energy across a region or what have you. We also had multiple countries involved, and when we started doing that, we actually started by interviewing a number of clients. And we said, what is the biggest, if you had one bet, where would you actually, what would help you the most? Most of them said, well, intelligence would actually help me a lot, rightly so. So we started to work on, because we had that confirmation from multiple clients, and I must say also that, I'm not sure if he's in the room, Freddy de Zeure from CERTIU was also one of the people that helped us a lot in shaping this initiative. We said, let's convene a meeting with these, I think it was 50 organizations at the time, and start to not convince ourselves, but let's go into the meeting with a plan and say, okay, let's assume we're all convinced that this is what we should be doing. How should the world look like? So we worked for quite a significant amount of time to actually shape a project, which we documented in like a 50-page document, like a prospectus, if you will. And we gave it to the 50 organizations, and we said, well, you were convinced already, this is how we're going to do it. If you come to the meeting, we'll explain you everything, and if you're willing to play, we'll play. So that was basically the setting of the meeting. So that was very interesting. So, and then we said, okay, what problem are we going to solve? And then, well, first of all, we are convinced that information sharing will actually help us protect from bad things on our systems and on the internet. But there are, from the consultations we've had with various organizations, these 6 items were actually the items that were actually coming as a common denominator from the interviews. And some of them might be maybe surprising, but first of all, lack of efficient tools and channels to share this knowledge, and I think still today that is still a valid concern. The second one, the commercial vendors are not always sharing intelligence because it's simply not in the best of their interest. And that's maybe a hard message, but that is what our clients are saying, so we should listen to those messages. We also talked about this morning about impacted organizations. They are not always, they are reluctant to share information, but I think there is a difference between the fact that you saw something happening on your systems, on your network and what have you, whether it has been a successful attack. And that, I think, is a very important distinction, and we should be mindful of that in whether we all see things every day, every minute. So there's a lot of intelligence that is valuable to others in the market. The information sharing is usually unstructured, so we need to actually have a better way of doing that. And it's also valid for a particular time period. And what I spoke to Freddie not so long ago, and his perception of things was that the lifetime of a indicator of compromise today is a number of seconds. So he doesn't believe that it's a long lifetime anymore. And obviously, we need to have a disciplined and structured approach which will not do it on a case-by-case basis, because that is very resource. We have limited resources, and if we do it on a case-by-case basis, that will not help us actually to run our business. So the project was really aimed to increase the level of protection against the targeted attacks, and also across country, across industry, and across sectors. And that was very important to see whether the same indicators of compromise would we find them back in different industries, different countries, and so on. Obviously we did, and that was also an interesting learning, I guess, from the project that we did. So the project was actually believed to deliver the following benefits. So a better protection against targeted attacks. So it was targeted attacks that we were actually trying to work for. Then the creation of a trusted community, and I think trust was mentioned already by Fabrice as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of minutes as well. Implementing a proof of concept, which will actually take care of some of the issues that we saw on the previous slide, that the system, the process, the standards were missing. And then also a vision towards the future in terms of how we as a community can actually collaborate, work together on sharing intelligence or technical indicators of compromise. In order to achieve those objectives, we had a number of project streams. And the first one was really about infrastructure, because obviously infrastructure is important. Without the infrastructure, you cannot exchange that information. So there we focused on agreeing on a common infrastructure that everybody was willing to adopt, and that was willing to use for the purpose of this information sharing environment. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Then there are a couple of operational processes, because if you start to dig into the details of information sharing, you will see that there are many different things that will actually come into play and that we find difficult to solve. So the operational processes is certainly one of the elements that we have to consider as you are starting with an information sharing environment. And then community and governance. So I think the essence that we have the data, most of us have the data, not all of them, but not all of us have the data, but collectively we have a lot of information. So the governance of the community is very, very important. And it's also referred to, I think, in different words by Fabrice this morning in terms of trust. But the governance, I think, is very important, and you will see later in the learnings that this is obviously a very key part of that. And obviously, like any project, we needed to have a solid project management, because we're dealing with sensitive topics, sensitive information, sensitive processes, so we needed to actually be very strong on the project management side to actually make sure we maintain the trust within the community. So that is a little bit of where the project started and how we got to that point. And again, that was back in 2012, 2013 when we started that. And still today, I think these are elements which are very important. Hello? Just wait. If you bear with me for a second. Does it work? Hello, hello, hello. I think I have sound. Hello? This one works. So we'll adjust to the new norm. So if you think about the evolution of the project. So what in the beginning, when we looked at all of these streams, we thought that we would probably be able to. Hello? Yes? Okay. We'll probably be able to start on each of these streams and do them in parallel so that we can actually achieve best results going forward. If you can't hear me, raise your hands because I don't hear myself here. So we were going to do that in parallel, but at the end of the day, when we started the project in the first couple of months, we see that was probably too ambitious and maybe a little bit naive from the group. And so we said that in the beginning, the foundation of every information sharing platform is really about trust. So if you don't have the trust within the community, forget about everything else. You don't start. You just don't start. Forget about the infrastructure. Forget about everything else. Trust is the first thing that we need to do. And then we can actually start building a couple of other things. And I will go, and that is a very important learning. So that is table stakes. We need to have trust before we start anything. And I think that John, just before me, also talked about why they set up the site at Cisco is really about trust, but that is really step one, because that is so important. And I think the next slide is probably going to give it in much more readable context. So the second thing we needed to do is about technology and understand, okay, how are we going to exchange the information? We choose, because we had, of course, NATO and the Belgian MOD and a number of other players that were familiar with MISP. We choose MISP platform to actually exchange the data, and which was a good choice. It was a good choice because there are multiple advantages to that. So, but obviously if you have, and I go back to a couple of slides earlier, we had telecom, we had oil and gas, we had financial services, we had many different industries. Do you think that all of these guys are familiar with MISP? They don't. They don't. Do you think that the engineers that are actually working in the cyber place in those organizations are familiar with MISP? They don't. So we need to actually make sure that these people are also have the right information about the technology that we're using to actually share that information. Then organizations need to organize themselves and actually to share information. What are they allowed to share? What are they not allowed to share? So those are important questions which they need to do. And then ramp up is actually to get activity on the platforms. If you talk about trust, what are the learnings that we had from the creating the trust? So first of all, physical meetings. I think it's important that you can actually look one another in the eyes and actually have a conversation. Why you are sitting at the table? What is your challenge? How can we help each other? So the trust piece of physical meetings is very, very important, because if you talk about cross-sector, cross-country, cross-industry, then these people have never met before. They don't know each other. So they need to actually, they need to travel to participate in a physical meeting and to look into each other's eyes and say, yes, we trust each other and we know why we're in this game. So that is very important that we have these physical meetings. We also had regular calls to actually continue the conversation. So we had 3 monthly meetings, but that was not good enough. They needed to actually have a touch point in between, because if you only meet once every 3 months, that's not a good platform to create trust. So we need to actually have much more interaction with these people to talk about with a clear agenda to actually create the trust. And then it's not about legal, but there are a number of things that we need to take care of. And I'll give you a couple of examples in terms of the things we need to do. The first one was actually the use of the information. So you're allowed to use the information which is in the platform for your proper use only. So you're not allowed to actually share that information with others which are not part of the community, of the trusted community. You're not allowed to sell on that information. You're allowed to use that information for your proper use. Very important. The second one is ownership. Nobody can actually claim ownership of all the data because there is data in there from various members. And you can claim ownership of your own data, which you have anyway, but you cannot claim ownership of all the data. So that was also an important principle. The third one was actually about termination. So if a certain organization is actually deciding to leave the trusted community for certain reasons, they have to commit to destroy the data. And that was also very important, that was documented in a little thing. And then confidentiality or trademarks, that people will not use other organizations' name and so on. And that's also the reason why I'm not mentioning all the organizations that have participated in that. There are a couple of other things that needed to formalize, like a small NDA. And what we also did on the second bullet there was actually to create some technical committees, because we have a CISO or a cyber leader of a certain organization at the governance table, very strategic. We talk about information sharing, very interesting, very valuable. But still, the people that have to do the activities and that will be involved are the engineers and the technical people that work in their teams. So we needed to connect, actually have some technical meetings to actually make sure that we connect the technical people from these organizations into a similar platform as well. And that was also very valuable because these people had very different threat profiles, so they could learn from each other in terms of how to deal with particular threat and threat patterns. And then some rules of the road for the next year, which are probably less important. And then the technology. I told you that the technology was a key element of the second evolution of the platform. The first one was actually the MISP is here, the choice we have made. And we needed to actually clarify to the participating organization what MISP can and what MISP cannot do. And that, I think, is important, because otherwise they cannot integrate it into their own environment, and they start having different expectations from the initiative, from the technology, and from the collaboration that we have within the platform. So most of you, I assume, are familiar with MISP, which has been developed by NATO and the Belgian MOD mainly, but also CERT-EU. And it has a couple of capabilities which are very valuable for the purposes of the project that we run. But it's very important. So we had a central instance, a central MISP instance for the community. So it was a secure instance for the community where each member could access to. But also there was a separate instance that they could actually install on their own, on their end, to actually facilitate the communication with the community, between that organization and the community. What was a little bit of a difficulty here is because MISP was new for quite a number of players in these different industries and countries, is actually how to connect their internal MISP to their internal infrastructure. And that, I think, was something that organizations struggled with. It was also hindering them to actually feed more data into the platform. Most of you are familiar with MISP, I think, so it has a little list here of what MISP can and cannot do. I don't think I'm going to go into the detail here. This one is also an important slide. So I said that, so we first had trust, the second one was about technology, and the third one was really about how to organize themselves. So every organization has different levels of maturity when it relates to intelligence sharing, and the use of intelligence. And you have, in our model, we have here like 4 levels, from initial to managed to defined to optimized, with the definitions that are underneath there. And when we brought the community together, you can think of an oil and gas company, a pharmaceutical company, an energy company, a whatever company. You can immediately think that there are different levels of maturity. Like, for instance, NATO is much more mature than a normal private sector organization, because they simply have different budgets, different organizations, different challenges, and therefore they are less mature. Now, how do you exchange if the people, the engineers in these organizations, if you bring them together, they don't talk the same language? They don't have the same technology. They don't have the same processes to actually talk about intelligence, share intelligence, and use intelligence. And that I think we have, although everybody was very eager to use and learn and get on the boat of intelligence, you need two to tango. And if you have a number of organizations together that are talking different languages, that have different levels of maturity, that are not familiar with the technology, which I talked about in the previous slides, then it's very difficult to actually have that. Although you might have the trust and the willingness, it's very difficult to make it happen. So I think the lesson learned on this one is that when you build the trust, talk about the maturity that you have, because you're all implementing different levels of maturity, different levels of technology, infrastructure, architectures. So you need to actually make sure that there is a way how you can connect and operationalize that information sharing. So in a good environment that has a reasonable level of maturity, you receive information, you're able actually to use it in an automated or non-automated way. You can actually detect incidents based on your infrastructure. You can actually analyze the incident and also confirm the CTI. Then you can enrich that with contextual information, and then you can actually start sharing that information. And it continuously circles around, but that is a mature organization that will be able to do that. But most of the organizations, or quite a few of our organizations, are not actually able to do it the way we are displaying that on this chart. Just be aware of that when you start entering in the room for an information sharing platform and you have your first meeting to build trust, and you're able to do all of that. I can assure that not everyone in the room is up to that level and can do everything that maybe you are able to do, which causes then some issues afterwards. So that means that if from an internal organization point of view, and this is not an organizational design, this is just about some roles, we need some malware analysts, we need some incident handling officers, obviously the network security team, and then security monitoring team, who have all a role to play in an information sharing initiative. Although initially you wouldn't think or anticipate that all of these people are involved. So the information sharing processes and initiatives are much more intrusive into our organization, security organization, policies, practices, procedures, than we might think of in the beginning. And that, I think, is also one of the key learnings that we had from the project. So, and then suppose we have dealt with the trust. We trust each other very well. We understand the technology that we use. We have implemented that. We have embedded that and integrated that into our own infrastructure and environment, and it works seamlessly so that we can actually use and leverage that in an efficient and effective way. So I just recapped the previous slides, but there's a lot of work to do that, actually, as you know. And then apart from that, we also have the human element, the human factor. We have our teams aligned, and they're all willing and understand the overall goal of intelligence and how that is part of our cyber defense capabilities. So then, if that is all okay, then with the community, across country, across sector, and so on, then we can actually ramp up and actually do some real business and start creating some, sharing a lot of information. And obviously, as you see here on your right, there is a lot of effort to actually prepare for intelligence sharing. I think it's not if you want to do it a real way, and I think in an effective way, that you also get the value from that. And also, as John was saying, the previous speaker, about the time that we don't have to work on it, we actually should shorten the time to actually work the intelligence, but actually shorten the time and use it. I think it's important that we understand the processes to eliminate also the false positives, but also to extract the value that we have to prevent attacks and so on, successful attacks. So we need to encourage them, and then is the next thing, and then the trust comes back into, actually on your left you see the encourage, how can we encourage members to actually start sharing that? Once you have done that, then we need to actually have the governance in place to actually start sharing that information. So who can share? What are we allowed to share? Everything, like John said, or particular parts of that? There are some bulk uploads as well. Some organizations, they actually have a lot of data. They do bulk uploads. So what is the quality of the data from I'll just... Hello? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. So the way forward, automation was obviously important. Reduce the false positives, I think, is also very important to actually keep up the value of the initiative. And then the interoperability with STIX, TAXI, or any other standard that we all agree on is very important. There are a couple of questions. How much is detected because of the usage of the feeds? I think is important to actually have that as a KPI as well. So whatever feed you are using, are you actually getting the benefit from the platform that you're using? And how many false positives are being created by the system? There are a couple of others. The level of confidence, I think, is also an important element because you're using multiple feeds from multiple sources. What is the level of confidence that you have from each of the sources? And within this platform, we could also then identify what the level of confidence is of a certain technical indicator of compromise that we share through the platform. I think the options there are about governance on who are we sharing with, what are the roles and responsibilities for the people that can actually that are altering a certain level of information. So, in a nutshell, what we have been able to achieve is a central and a secure ability to actually share information with a variety of organizations from different industries, organizations, and countries, which in itself was, I think at that time, and I think still today, is quite unique. I don't think that is still happening in other places either. We have been able to establish a trust relationship with these organizations, and I think that still today, it's a virtual organization. They meet, they talk amongst themselves, they meet through the platform. So it's still very, it takes a couple of years. I think it was a John or somebody else that mentioned that, I think Fabrice perhaps, but it takes a number of time. But I think if you stick to the agenda, you don't go out of scope, you stay with a structured agenda, I think you have the ability to actually create that trust, and the details are important in that process. From bringing the people together, they learn from each other, and I'm referring to the different levels of maturity that organizations have when dealing with information intelligence, cyber intelligence. So they learn, they share best practices, they share concerns, they share good things and bad things, and that is helping, that creates a trust. One helps another, so that is really helpful for the organizations they learn every time when they come to one of these meetings and when they leave back to their organization. And then last but not least, we have also created some materials from what we've learned that the organizations can use to take to their organization to create awareness and to actually get everybody aligned on the use of Intel within their organization and within the community. And these are the key conclusions. I hope that what I've shared today was giving you, it's very practical, and it's hard. It were hard lessons to learn sometimes because you were wondering back in 2012 when why doesn't that go faster? Why don't we have much more IOCs on the platform? The ramp up was very, very slow, and you saw participating organizations that were very committed to the platform that were not sharing Intel. Why? So we went out there, we talked to them, we understood their problems, their issues. We talked to many of them, and what we've shared today are a number of lessons that I'm very pleased to be able to share with you. And I hope that you can think of those lessons and use them in a positive way in your own communities, in your own countries, organizations, And if there are any questions, I'm not sure, Paul, if we have a few minutes or so, and otherwise I'll be at the Deloitte stand later on. Thank you very much for your attention, and speak to you later. Bye-bye.
We've got... thank you, Chris. We do have, can you hear me on this mic? Yeah. We do have time for a couple of questions, if there are any questions from the floor. Oh, I have a question. Oh, sorry, there's a question down there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Basir Riot, NATO Innovation Hub. I may have a possible solution, but you are the expert, so please let us know. When it comes to information sharing, building trust, do you think retired intelligence disclosure officers, retired military intelligence guys will be able to do a better job as opposed to a regular civilian because they know they are able to, in a way, appraise the sensitivity and collate the information? I don't know. It's a yes or a no, or thank you.
It is probably a yes, and I'll tell you because these people know the industry. But there's a big gap between private industry and this community that you're referring to. And I don't think that the willingness, rightly or wrongly so, on private industry to engage with these kind of people for sensitive matters is very open. I think there must already be some level of trust between that organization and that individual in order to actually go after that kind of thing. I know a couple of organizations, in fact, that have hired these kind of individuals for certain roles. But it's I think, to actually have that, so the answer is yes, but I think there is some gap to close when we talk about private organizations. They are not waiting for these individuals, I think, to actually doing all of the stuff that we would normally expect from them. So the answer is yes, but I guess is probably a fair answer.
Time for one more quick question. Lady with the ash hair.
Hello? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Agata Szydełko from NCI Agency. Well, you just happened to be the last one, and I must say that the key word that went through all the presentations was the trust. So this comes to the conclusion that the people are the key success or key failure factor of the cybersecurity. Now, from the project that you described, which is very interesting too, did you draw any conclusions on the enhancing or some lessons learned on the training? It wasn't in your presentation, but I wonder whether you did actually have some insight into that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think your conclusion is certainly one of the conclusions that people are essential to a successful cyber defense. In the context of the project, we did do a lot of information sharing that could be categorized as training to the people in the room. And that was very important because there were many people in the room with totally different levels of maturity. And so we needed to actually have the same baseline for everyone who sat at the table, who sits at the table of the governance committee, which is the top layer of our initiative. So the technical people is a different thing. They learn from each other by talking to each other about certain topics. But we needed to create a level playing field around the governance committee with all the people in the room that had various degrees of maturity. It wasn't called really training. It was part of us actually creating the trust when two people talk, that they understand each other. Several organizations have actually told us that on the back of this community, they were actually able to achieve a much higher level of a maturity much faster because of the platform, because of the project, because they were actually to talk to people who've done that before, who've been to the issues, and all of that stuff. So in a sense, it was not training, but it was part of of the collaboration, the facilitation, the physical meetings where the community met and actually talked about each of the individual and collective issues. So it's not really training per se, but it's actually, as I mentioned, the sharing of best practices, which was very helpful and allowed them to actually get to a higher level of maturity much faster. Is a training important? I think yes it is, but the question is, who do you train and on what? I don't think that everybody needs to have the same level of training. So for instance, in the governance committee, we have people that are more senior, that talk about the concepts, the ideas, and the end game. Where we talk with the engineers, it's probably a different ball game, where we talk about how do we use the intelligence, what are the processes that we use, what are the protocols, and all of that stuff. So it's also a different kind of training for different stakeholders in the entire cyber intelligence sharing. Did that answer your question? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chris, thank you very much indeed, my friend.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Sorry about the mic.
No.